All right, everybody. So today we have Shannon Beer on the podcast. How you doing, Shannon?
I'm good. How are you?
Good. So this is our first time really connecting. I had seen you more in the last few months, maybe longer than that now, with Gabrielle Fundaro. She's probably been on the podcast like 4 or 5 times now, so she's a regular here. And I know that you guys have been doing some coaching stuff together, and I've seen you pop up more and more. So before we delve into the topics, can you just tell people a little bit about your background here?
Yeah, sure. So I am an MNU certified nutritionist. I also hold an LLB from King's College, but I work now as an online coach. And I would say that my goal is to promote flourishing health, which is something Gabrielle and I speak about a lot. It's just a broader conceptualization of health that considers more than just physical health, in order to enhance our clients' overall well-being and just help them to become, I guess, like the best version of themselves. So we've been collaborating recently on a framework of coaching that we've termed comprehensive coaching, and it is a holistic, nutritionally agnostic, and weight impartial approach to facilitating behavior change from the inside out. So we're meeting the client where they are at and coming up with a direction together. And we host webinars and run the comprehensive coaching community group to help bring coaches and clients together. And we kind of, I guess, explore the intersections of health, wellness, fitness, food, and psychology. They've also produced a 5-part body image webinar series. I authored a book called Life After Dieting, and I mentor other coaches as well to help them broaden and develop their services. I also host my own podcast. I guess it's kind of more about a bit broader, like science, philosophy, psychology, and literature, just to explore some of those interests as well.
Very cool. Very cool. Yeah, I actually do know some other coaches who have talked about getting involved with what you and Gabrielle are doing, and I've only heard positive things. So it seems like a cool thing.
Oh, that's awesome.
So, the theme of this kind of roundtable podcast here, or I guess a variation of a roundtable, is that, I've mentioned I've started to train more women. I've had more women clients. And for years now, even, before I was training as many people, it does seem like eating disorders and body image issues and things like that are more prevalent in women. And certainly you see it in men too. That's one of the other things I've kind of learned as I've gotten more involved with training, just people in general. You do certainly see it in men, but I would say it's more prevalent in women. And it honestly almost seems like the majority of women in this space, at least, and now, of course, there's a huge selection bias there, but it almost seems like the majority have some disordered eating, some unhealthy relationship with food. And so I kind of, wanted to talk with somebody like you with your experience about, one, where does that kind of stem from? And two, what you have found to implement, in your time coaching that has helped that.
Yeah, I would say the same thing in that I have noticed a lot of disordered eating type behaviors in my clients, whether that's restricting certain foods, restricting amounts of foods, or just food preoccupation. So thinking about what someone's going to eat all of the time, or being very inflexible with their food intake. For example, having a fear of moving away from tracking macros. What do I do? Like feeling some kind of compulsion to constantly track. So those are like some of the types of behaviors and cognitions that I've noticed. And I think one of the crucial things here is that disordered eating behaviors are more prevalent than eating disorders. And as you mentioned with the selection bias, it's pretty likely that a fair few of our clients may be displaying those behaviors because it's closely related to dieting. And I don't know about you, but a lot of my clients come to me wanting to change their body composition. So we're kind of working with a risky population. And the important thing is that when someone has disordered eating behaviors, it's very difficult to spot that in yourself, which I think puts the impetus on us as coaches to be able to recognize those thoughts, those behaviors, and to raise our concerns or to help a client address them if they wish to. So some of the things that I think have been helpful for me is firstly understanding like the nature of the eating concerns. So I've worked with people who really struggle to allow themselves to eat certain foods, just cutting out foods, like specific foods. So I guess viewing certain foods as good or bad can be quite common. And then also evaluating themselves, depending on whether they've eaten a bad food or now I am a bad person for eating a bad food, right? There are also people who, it's quite common that I found, restrict a lot during the day and then struggle with overeating at night because they're pretty hungry, and thinking that that's the extent that they need to go to in order to lose some weight. I've also worked with people who, again, have just really struggled with thinking about food all the time and holding themselves back from certain aspects of their life because of their concerns around what food will be available, or not feeling confident in themselves to go away for a weekend, for example, and not knowing how to eat on the fly because they're so used to having a plan in place and meal prepping and tracking everything. So depending on the type of eating behavior, I think there'd be different ways to address that. For example, with a client who is struggling with restriction during the day and overeating at night, one of the biggest things to do is to help them to be able to eat regular meals throughout the day. So at least they're not physiologically, starving and primed to overeat in the evening. And there's also a lot of, I guess, addressing thoughts that goes on as well, because oftentimes the problem isn't with the food itself. It's more so what the food represents or the motivations and intentions behind dieting and restriction in the first place. And that's kind of where I started to look into the body image work, because a lot of the time someone's relationship with food will reflect the relationship that they have with themselves. And not always, but sometimes the reason that someone restricts and feels such a I guess, urgent impulse to restrict is because they really want to change how they look. They're really dissatisfied with their appearance, and it's very important to them to look a certain way. So a lot of the body image work comes in alongside addressing some of those behaviors and cognitions.
Yeah. I think, you mentioned how a lot of people, most of your clients come to you want to improve their body composition. And I think that furthers the selection bias towards, seeing it with women, because I think women in general tend to have some more of these issues. But then on top of that, it's much more rare for a woman to say, hey, I want to bulk up, right? I mean, that exists for sure. And certainly, I think when you see women who have been in the space for a while and they realize the benefits of maybe having higher body fats at times and gaining muscle, you do see that. But in general, the vast majority, especially in Gen Pop, the vast majority of women's goals are to lose weight, be skinnier, things like that. Whereas certainly a lot of men want to lose fat too, but a lot of men want to bulk up. And so if anything, to be able to tell them, hey, you get to eat more, like this is a good thing, that's a huge aspect of it. And then two, if you get into like a societal view of it, I mean, personally, I've made many comments on my YouTube channel about how when I bulk up and I gain body fat, I actually tend to get more compliments because, 99% of the time I have my clothes on. And so that's how people see me. And so it's like, oh, wow, man, you're looking big. Versus for a woman, generally speaking, that's not what they want. That's not how they want to be perceived. So it furthers that selection bias and that predisposition towards women dealing with these issues. So, I mean, that's just kind of like a general comment on it. But then also, as you mentioned, like once you start to train more and more people, you start to realize like there's such a variation in terms of what works for a certain person. Like for me, it was almost something I had to deal with. Like if I wanted to effectively coach people, I had to step back and kind of like, okay, just because, you don't know this, but when I started this, I was like 12 years old and there was always just no lack of willpower for me. I mean, it was always there. I would just do it. And so when I would just hear people say, oh, well, like, I don't know what to do. I just keep cheating on my diet. I was like, what do you mean? Like it was frustrating. I was like, well, just don't do it. But obviously saying that is not really, I mean, there's times where you have to be kind of more stern with somebody, but for the most part, like that's not an effective coaching principle to just say, well, just do it. So how have you found, for those who come to you and just say, I've repeated this problem, whether it's a binge at night or, whatever it is, I just want to get skinnier and skinnier. How have you found it's effective to address that issue without maybe putting a lot of blame on them or making them feel even worse? Like you said, maybe that they're a bad person for doing it or anything like that.
Yeah, I think it's really important to realize that willpower has very little to do with eating behaviors. And the reason that someone may struggle to quote unquote stick to a diet, there's a number of reasons why that may be the case. And it's not for a want of trying or a lack of trying. So I think the important thing is there to really think about the relationship that you have with your client, and knowing that sometimes a lot of these eating related behaviors are very personal, and there's a lot of, I guess, stigma around disordered eating and also weight as well. And I think it can be very difficult for someone to open up about those issues. So we as coaches need to be able to provide a safe space for clients to feel like they can talk to us and that they won't be judged. Because if we are judgmental towards our clients, that has the potential to induce shame, which is an emotion that facilitates self-concealment. So someone who experiences shame is likely to be fearful of being judged, and therefore they're not going to tell anyone what's really going on, because nobody wants to be judged by someone else. And this is like a problem that can get in the way of our intervention and our work together, because we need to understand what's going on in order to make any changes. So if a client has opened up about struggling to make a change, I think one of the most important aspects is to develop awareness and insight of what's going on. So if someone does regularly overeat, are they able to spot patterns, between these overeating episodes? Are they able to identify how they felt in the moment? Is there a trigger? And what did they do in response to that? What thoughts and emotions were arising? And then we can talk about those things. Just eliciting that awareness, I think, can help someone to understand themselves, because oftentimes, again, clients are likely to blame themselves anyway, putting it down to a lack of willpower, thinking that their struggle to get a grip on their eating behaviors is reflective of their self, some kind of personal failing, when really that's rarely ever the case. There's a lot of external factors and internal factors at play as well. So yeah, I think the most important thing there is developing that sort of relationship, having acceptance, unconditional positive regard, compassion, empathy for the person that you're working with, so that they feel able to discuss these things, and helping them to look at their own behaviors from a non-judgmental stance. Because again, if there's a lot of judgment going on, that's going to create a barrier to change. So I'd say that's probably the most important thing.
Yeah, you made a good comment that, it has very little to do with willpower. And I find that bodybuilders in general, but a lot of people, they love to give themselves undue credit. And that's not to say that like they don't work very hard. But it's very common to be like, because I even said it, right? Like I have like so much willpower. But it was funny, when I was in college, I had a friend who somebody had said, oh, you have so much willpower. And then my friend said, well, I don't really know if it's willpower. I think he's just got the habit at this point. And that really is true. At one point, like I did have to have like the initial willpower to make the change. And obviously sometimes you do have to use willpower when a certain temptation comes up. But for the most part, you've made a decision, you implement the patterns, and over time, it just becomes the norm. And at this point, it would be weird for me not to go to the gym. Like I would actually feel more uncomfortable just saying like, well, I'm just going to stop going to the gym, than the opposite, right? And so I think that that's a really good point, because if you rely on willpower, I don't know anybody who's been doing this for 10 plus years, who has made it like a lifestyle, who's still like do I want to get up in the morning to work out or not? And they have to make that decision every time. It just becomes part of it, right? Just like, brushing your teeth or whatever else you do. So I just thought that was a really good point. And secondly, you mentioned, the kind of like unconditional empathy and things like that. And I think the empathy is really important. I'm wondering, do you ever have a point where, I don't want to say that you don't coddle them, but more like that you feel like you need to be more stern with them, that, if you were to and I don't know if there is a female versus male difference here in terms of the client, but that maybe a harsher tone at times could help them if it's somebody who you just keep seeing fall into the same negative pattern over and over.
No, pretty much no. For the people that I work with, I think tough love is kind of glorified in the industry, right? No days off, grind, hustle mentality, all that kind of stuff. We see that a lot. But there's I don't see any scientific evidence that shows that that's actually helpful. And there's a lot of evidence behind the idea of compassion towards ourselves and others for facilitating behavior change. Is actually associated with increased motivation to change, and also I guess being able to take a more realistic perspective on your own personal failings and being able to take responsibility for that, because there's not a fear of judgment. You're not trying to conceal anything. So I would imagine that there are people out there who like the tough love approach, right? There's probably people who feel like when like the whip has been cracked, they really enjoy that. For example, at the moment, I'm taking private BJJ lessons. I want my coach to tell me what I'm crap at so that I don't get submitted when I'm rolling with people. I don't mind that. Like, for me, I'm not bothered. I don't take it as a like global assessment of my self-worth. But when it comes to coaching others, particularly with nutrition and weight, that are like sensitive topics that come with risks, I don't think it's worth risking a tough love approach unless you have a really good relationship with your client. Like, as in, that client, you've been working with them for a long time. I work with a range of people. Some people don't like the idea of kindness, and they're probably the people that maybe need it the most.
Yeah.
So I don't necessarily use the words compassion, but I may say, hey, let's take a more rational look at things here, which usually involves a kind of voice, when we're addressing like critical talk or whatever. Because again, the reason that someone's struggling to change usually isn't a lack of motivation. So I don't really see the utility of cracking the whip, because that wasn't why they struggled in the first place. Instead, we need to understand the root of the problem, which again requires being able to look at behaviors that may be quite difficult, and thoughts as well that may be quite difficult to address. And I don't think that berating someone is ever going to help them do that. So yeah, if I was to see, I guess, evidence of tough love and when it's appropriate, then that would be awesome, because it's certainly easier to do, you know, and everyone enjoys cracking the whip. But at this stage, I don't really see much applicability for that, especially, as I say, when there are risks involved anyway. I would rather take an approach that appears to be more beneficial and is lower in risk.
Yeah. Yeah. And I really asked that question, like, genuinely, in the sense that, like, I really don't know the answer when it comes to that. I've had times where I had to, I don't know, I wouldn't even call it be stern. I've had to, set time aside to talk to the client about having realistic goals, because they were constantly disappointed about not being further along. And so I just had to have a very real talk with them that, like, look, like, this is where you're at. This is what is achievable. This would be really great progress. But again, I wasn't, berating them. Certainly, I can't imagine ever berating a client. But I don't know, maybe there's different tones and, how it comes across. And again, context is hugely important there as well. So I guess just kind of as like a final piece here, I know that a lot of the people I've talked to, it's that, like we talked about, that maybe the willpower is necessary for that initial step. And once you get into the habit, I think for a lot of people maybe listening, they are still in that initial phase where it's like, okay, maybe like I hate the way I look every time I look in the mirror, or, I really want to go downstairs and make that whole batch of brownies, whatever, but they haven't reached out to anybody to help. Maybe they have or have not seen a therapist, which, could be helpful as well. How do you find that most people end up coming to you? Is it people that have never had any type of coaching with that before? For those people who really need that initial push, any suggestions if they're listening to this? Maybe this is a little more comfortable for them than reaching out directly, since it's anonymous. They're not really, putting their profile or anything out there at this point.
Yeah, I have had, again, I work with a range of people. So a lot of them have had coaches before, but also a lot of them haven't. And they don't really know what coaching involves. And I think most people reach out to me after having gone through my content, say on Instagram, or read some of the articles that I've written, or have listened to me on podcasts. So at that stage, they're fairly familiar with some of my ideas or just my philosophy towards coaching. And I also have people just reach out and ask questions, and I'm happy to respond to that, to just give, I guess, initial guidance to help someone, because I do think that sometimes the idea of change can be quite overwhelming and, I guess, quite scary, not knowing where to start and also being fearful of what the process may involve. So I think really understanding your motivations to want to make a change and the impact, like considering the impact that it may have on your life, I think can be a big step there to maybe give someone the push to reach out. What would happen if I continued on the way that I have been? Where would my life be headed? And what could the alternative be? What would happen if I did get help with these issues? I think that can be something worth considering if someone is struggling with the idea of reaching out to someone.
Awesome. Well, Shannon, thank you very much for taking the time for the segment. And I know you mentioned that you do help a lot of people here. So where can people reach out to you?
I think the best place to find me would be on Instagram. So that's just Shannon Beer _, or you can also check out my website, which is shannonlbeer.com. As I mentioned, I do have a bunch of articles, the podcast that I've been featured on, my podcast as well. So I'm sure there'll be something there. And yeah, any of those places would be a good place to contact me.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
All right, everybody. So we have back on the podcast, Dr. Gabrielle Fundaro. How are you doing?
I'm good. I'm enjoying the Arizona winter. It's like, or spring, I guess. It's like 90 degrees already.
Yeah, it is like 65 here, which is actually really nice relative to what we've been dealing with. We had like 5 snow days this summer or this winter. It's been a rough winter. I'm missing South Carolina for sure.
Oh yeah. That's pretty intense there.
Yeah. So this is now, I think we have gonna have 4 or 5 total, but for this one, I think you're the third one I've talked to so far. And basically the idea behind it, it's almost like a round table, but everybody individually, because there's no way I was gonna coordinate 5 different people. Like you're all over the world basically, so there's no way we were gonna coordinate it. But I talked to Shannon, I talked to a couple other people, and so basically the idea here is, as I've gotten more female clients, there are patterns I see, and you see it in male clients as well, but you definitely see it more, at least I've noticed it more in female clients. And I think the literature supports that it's more prevalent in women, that, the general topic of eating disorders and body dysmorphia and things like that. But I think with you, since you have such a strong nutritional background, and obviously you have the coaching background, of course, as well, maybe we can get a little bit of a different take on it. But just the idea of like, why is it more prevalent in women? Is that more of like a social thing? Is it just something inherent to women there? And 2, as far as actions to take to correct it, when you look at how a lot of, like we were just talking about off air, a lot of the motivation that I see in women comes almost from like I don't want to call it self-hate, but it, like you said, like they're almost, some of them are like disgusted with how they look. And it's almost like, I want to do this so that I can accept myself. Whereas, and again, just as a general trend, a lot of guys are more like, this body is awesome, I want to get to that. But I don't see that, again, that kind of like self-hate so much. So I don't think that's a very broad category. I don't know if you want to take anything from there.
Yeah. Well, I think when we take a look back throughout history and the way that a woman's appearance has been tied to her value and her character, We can maybe borrow a quote from the early 1900s. I want to say it was in a newspaper. A woman's, it was something like, a woman's value fades out as her double chin fades in. So now it's maybe not quite as overt, but there are still different standards of beauty and aesthetic for men and women. I think there's a greater amount of flexibility for men. Not to say that they aren't held to a standard at all, but there are sort of like niche appearance standards like dad bod. Yep. That, acknowledge that there's a specific appearance that is not one that's super sculpted, but it's sort of met in like a cheeky way. It's kind of fun, like, oh, dad bod, you know, and you can get like a fanny pack that looks like you have, a little stomach pooch and things like that. And so people are lighthearted about it. And it doesn't tie in as much to the man's value and worth as a human being, because he is if he's providing for his family, then he has value, then he has worth. Not to say that that's fair either, but it's not something that is so intrinsically attached to his appearance.
Sure.
Whereas with a woman who 100 years ago was sort of a commodity, marriages were a business arrangement. A woman was a homemaker. She had to be fertile. She had to produce children, and she had to be easy on the eyes. And so as beauty standards and ideals kind of shifted in the early 1900s, there was a movement away from the sort of like plump and Rubenesque ideal female figure associated with abundance and food security to a thin ideal. And thinness became synonymous with a high level of self-control, good moral character, rationality, science, modernism. And so if a woman was in a large body, she was seen as less valuable, less worthwhile than a woman in a thin body. And the reason that women might experience what you talked about as self-hatred, I think about that more as shame. So there's a lot of shame tied to the way our bodies look, because our bodies are a way for us to establish safety and security. If we are deemed desirable by a man in our society, that means that we're safe because we've been because we're desirable and because we're acceptable, that there's no fear of rejection. And shame is really the fear of rejection due to some level of inadequacy, that we will be deemed unfit for this society and will be cast out. And when we take an evolutionary perspective, that can be really scary, because we can't, as humans, really thrive in isolation. Take one person and remove them from their social circle, and they're going to face real challenges, if they're out in the wilderness. And we still have that same sort of fear response to the idea of rejection. And so when a woman looks at her body as her ticket to acceptance and desirability and love and value and worthiness, then of course, if she feels that she's not fitting the specific ideal, there's a sense of fear and urgency there to hurry up and fit that ideal, or else who knows what's going to happen? Am I going to end up alone? Whereas a man might feel that way if he doesn't feel that he can provide for a family.
Right. So, and I'm glad you kind of touched on like the reason behind it, because we see these things and they could say, well, it's not fair. But as you explain, I mean, historically, there's reasons behind this. And to some degree, I mean, I think it's always great to, just because something might not seem realistic now doesn't mean we shouldn't strive for it. I would wonder, and your opinion on it, do you think that's something that's ever going to be completely even between men and women? Because when you look at it, I mean, just generally, we know that like on average, right, men are seen as more attractive based on status and wealth and ability to provide. And certainly, I think most people would say, well, if their male partner is also good looking, that's great. But it's certainly not like the highest priority. Whereas socioeconomic status is not irrelevant when a man is looking at a female partner, but it's much less relevant, right? And their appearance is much more relevant. I'm just wondering, do you see that as something that's changeable, or do you think it's more like, okay, let's just recognize it and then try to adapt?
I have hope that at some point we might, as humans, be able to arrive at a place, because we've acknowledged it, where we're practicing more, I want to say, acceptance and inclusivity and maybe awareness. I don't know that we could ever create something that's completely equal and the same. So, people who identify as men and people who identify as women, there's like no difference between them at all. And we have, reached some like Zen level of, our physical bodies are just vessels.
Yeah.
That's going to happen. But I do think that there is potential and capacity for us to, even from a very practical standpoint, like educate about the origins of beauty ideals and standards and how they might change, how they differ culturally. And from there, with that awareness, be able to acknowledge and maybe diffuse from some of the like societal beliefs, so that we don't end up attaching so much of our worth and value to what others might think. So those standards can still exist, but maybe if we have enough education and mental health support, we can get to a place where we say, I might look different from this standard, but that doesn't mean that I'm less than, or that I have, or that I will be rejected, or that I will never find a partner. But I think that is, I don't know, like maybe decades down the road. I mean, beauty standards have changed. Obviously, women have far more rights now. But I think the other thing is that we don't maybe realize, in terms of like all of like modern humanity, how recent it is that women have had the right to vote and have been able to work full time and to support themselves and not have to be married, so like we are really like, we're like, wow, let's look for like, how is this possible? And it's like, we literally like just took the training wheels off on equal rights. And so it'll probably take a long time before we get there.
Right. Sure. Yeah. And just as an analogy, because I don't want to make this at all like a race thing, but just as to make a further analogy, it's one of those things where some people say, oh, I don't understand how people could think this way. And it's like, well, like there's actually a natural in-group bias, right? When you look at like a kind of like us versus they kind of a thing. And it's not, I mean, this isn't just for races. This is like when team sports of different countries and things like that. It is a natural reaction, even on an unconscious level, to have an in-group bias. But it's important that, okay, well, we're not animals, right? Or we are more evolved, and we can say, hey, we recognize this. Now let's take the conscious steps to actually do something about it. And like you, I can't imagine, we're ever going to get to a point where, hey, your physical attractiveness doesn't matter at all to me. And, I mean, that's very unlikely, but we can stop and say, hey, I'm not going to necessarily put like your self-worth based on that, and I don't think it's ever going to be perfect, but you're right. I mean, if you look at just 20 years ago, 50 years ago, huge strides have already been made. So I think the progress is there.
Yeah, exactly. And now that people are speaking about it more openly, I think it's going to be sort of like maybe a grassroots type of effort, where we have these types of conversations, but also acknowledging that, we can't make people change. We can't make people change their minds. And so even though I understand like the intentions of people that are maybe like very intense about like sharing their opinions about these things in order to affect change, that quite often, and I've heard this, I think it was on Sigma Nutrition podcast, Alan Flanagan was talking about sort of like social justice movements, and how quite often you'll hear, these opposing viewpoints, like the anti-diet side versus the people who are like very vehemently, people with obesity can never be healthy. That they're really kind of often, using kind of the same like logical fallacies and, like appeals to authority, or, arguments that lack so much context and nuance that they're kind of just inaccurate.
Yeah.
And so if we are going about it in that way, we probably won't make as much progress as if we kind of try to create or establish like some shared meaning. Like, what are some things that we do have in common? Like, is it really wrong to care about our appearance at all? Probably not. I mean, we can care about our physical body. We can care for it. But that looks very different from striving to meet some external expectations, that might actually put our health at risk because we think like, I have to look this certain way or I'll be judged by people. So it doesn't have to be this sort of like all or nothing approach of like, I'm going to like buck the system and like never exercise because I don't want people to tell me what to do. You can do those things for a different reason.
Yeah. So when you have, again, I'm sure you have some process of, when you initially take on a client, right, you can kind of see the patterns of how they're talking about themselves and, what they see. If you get the sense, I mean, obviously some people are just going to explicitly tell you, hey, I have a history of eating disorders, stuff like that. But in those situations and the ones where you can kind of tell somebody has some body dysmorphia or eating disorder issues, do you approach it differently? Obviously from a coaching standpoint, you probably do, right? And how you maybe talk to them and support that you give them. From a actual like nutritional approach, are there different approaches that you might apply so that they maybe don't spiral into a worse pattern? And I really don't know. I mean, if there's something that you do in that case.
I would say actually my approach to everyone is my approach in terms of the spirit and the attitude that I embody is the same with everyone. And so whether I have the sense that a person might be struggling with their relationship with food or they feel very comfortable with their relationship with food and body, I always strive to be a person providing them, with empathy, compassion. It's collaborative. There's a bi-directional exchange of information and expertise. So I'm never just telling them what to do. If they want information, then absolutely I provide it to them and I guide them. And my expertise, helps the journey along, helps things, helps to keep the journey a little less bumpy. But if I'm working with a person that seems to have some red flags in terms of eating pathology, it really depends on the reason that person has signed up with me and the rapport that we've established. Those two will influence the way that I might approach that conversation. Certainly if I observe some serious red flags that look like they need to be referred out, then I'll let that person know. I want to make sure that I give you the best support possible. And I think in this case, I wouldn't be able to do that. And so I would suggest checking out, the NEDA website. So the National Eating Disorders Association website and refer them out that way. If it's a person who has come to me because they've identified that they're in a cycle that is harmful to them or problematic or invasive in some way, the door is really open already to have that discussion. And it really just starts with, what's been going on and how's it affecting you? Where do you want to be? And how are we going to help you get there? What's the next thing that you feel comfortable doing? If a person has come to me, and this is less often the case now because my coaching has changed, but if a person comes to me for intentional weight loss, for the purpose of liking themselves more, kind of to pare it down, that can potentially be a slippery slope. Because when our motivations for change are to avoid shame or avoid the body that we don't like, or achieve some reward of like, a weight loss challenge, or I'll be liked, or I'll have happiness after this. That type of external motivation is powerful for initial change, but it's quite fleeting. And so those folks will often experience difficulties with adherence, which is totally normal. And in addition to that, those are some of the risk factors for experiencing some form of eating pathology. So if a person is losing entirely for aesthetic purposes with no consideration of health, then, or if they have a lot of perfectionism, if they have some body image disturbance, then it's more likely that they might already have some form of eating pathology.
Right.
And in that case, it might be, and it's quite often is, just a subclinical, collection of like experiencing guilt around eating, or feeling they can't have certain foods around the house. And it's difficult in that situation because the person has come to me for intentional weight loss. They have not come to me to work on their relationship with food.
Right.
And to bring that up is quite often going to be an unsolicited piece of advice, and it's going to be met understandably with resistance. So in those cases, far from telling people what to do, I will do my best to always be encouraging and supportive of what are normal eating behaviors. Like if you go out with your friends and you eat a hamburger, that person might express that they have guilt about it. And so we need to, of course, validate that their experience is real, like not, oh, you shouldn't feel guilty about that, because we're just telling them like what they shouldn't do, and that's not super helpful. But also to encourage some thought about like why they might feel guilty about that, and to really be supportive about the other aspects of that experience that were really positive for them. Like, oh, that's great. You went out with your friends, you were able to have fun. So awesome that you were practicing flexibility. It's normal to eat a hamburger from time to time. Would you like to talk to me about, how you felt about it? And if they don't want to, that's totally fine. So we invite that discussion, but we don't push it. But over time, as you start to establish a solid relationship with that person, sometimes the door opens to have that conversation. And the person might then realize that they don't have a really satisfying relationship with food, but they're feeling stuck. And then that's when you start to pick up on their discussion about wanting to change. But that has to happen first before we can just say, hey, this seems like it's a problem. Like, you probably shouldn't feel that way. Let me fix you. I'm not there to fix you.
Yeah, no, I think that's great. And even like what you mentioned about knowing like, hey, this might be something to refer out, like even with your pretty vast experience there, to know, I mean, there's also so much you can do, through consults and things like that. But, I see all the time, and, obviously coaching is not really regulated online at all. And there's some, I mean, obviously won't say who, but it was like, I do. And it was like, this is like everything, it's like, you want to like run faster, build muscle, do this, eating disorders, everything, just contact me for coaching. And I was like, and I know this person's like not super experienced. And I'm just like, how, like, that's really irresponsible. And like, even myself who, I've certainly read a lot about disordered eating. I have somebody close to me who's had a long history of it. I've read a lot about it. There are still certainly people where I say like, look, this is either out of my wheelhouse, or I'm just not comfortable. Like, the level of relationship I can have with you is not going to be sufficient compared to actually like seeing somebody about this, so, or it's just totally other spectrum. I've had people ask me like, can you prescribe me TRT? And I was like, I definitely cannot prescribe you that. But really, I mean, there's just a point of like, look, like online coaching is awesome, but there are some more serious issues where like this is not going to be enough, and you really need professional help for it.
Yeah, exactly. And like where, kind of like fitness professionals and practitioners can come in as sort of that middle ground, like there's, we can't, like, people deserve some level of support, and maybe they haven't been able to identify what's potentially problematic for them yet. And so an interaction with a very supportive and safe practitioner might be their route to being referred to someone who is, a specialist in eating disorders. Like if they do have a clinical eating disorder and they need to be referred out. But not everyone with some level of eating pathology necessarily needs to work with an eating disorder practitioner.
Sure.
That could potentially, like, I I imagine that if everyone with some level of eating pathology went to a practitioner, we might like run out of practitioners, you know? And
yeah.
so, but we can also be sort of a stopgap as well. So if a person's starting to exhibit some of those eating pathology behaviors, some things that are like, you know, it's a whole spectrum. So there's like just normal, and then there's sort of like, feeling a lot of guilt, feeling out of control about certain foods. If they're working with a practitioner who's really attuned to that, they might be able to help them, establish the normative adaptive behaviors before that progresses.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, if they're working with someone who kind of exacerbates that, then, you know, a practitioner could also potentially be sort of the catalyst for the development of a full-on eating disorder. So we really have to be cognizant and conscientious about our role and our influence, because the way that we speak to our clients can change the way that they speak to themselves, for better or worse.
Yeah, definitely. And so I obviously, with, you know, having, I think, probably 5 people on this podcast, I'm keeping a little bit shorter. So just as kind of like a wrap up for people listening, I'm sure a lot of people and a lot of women who are listening to this will relate to a lot of what you've said. Are there things where, I mean, I think if somebody has like a full-blown eating disorder, they're probably aware of it, right? Are there things where you can pinpoint, or these people can pinpoint themselves, kind of like the start of the slippery slope, whether it's things that they catch themselves saying or things that they're actually doing, different actions or whatever, that they can kind of catch it early before it kind of goes down that spiral?
Yeah, absolutely. So some of the sort of internal dialogue you might notice if you're having a lot of critical self-talk about your body, or if you are using sort of global statements about yourself. So one that's very common with eating pathology and body image disturbance is, I feel fat, but that word means many other things. It means I feel incapable, I feel insecure. So if we're using statements like that, or if we have beliefs that our body, is making a, or the scale will kind of determine our mood for the day. So if you're noticing that the scale might make you feel really bummed out for the entire day, or you feel really fearful about about getting on the scale. So there can be sort of body checking behaviors, feeling preoccupied, looking in the mirror a lot, feeling like you're compulsively weighing yourself, or body avoidance behaviors. So avoiding mirrors, not looking at yourself in pictures, and feeling really fearful about weighing yourself. Those could be some flags that there's some body image disturbance. And when it comes to a relationship with food, experiencing a lot of guilt or anxiety around foods that you feel like you can't keep in the house, or a food environment that you feel like you're out of control of, and that brings you a lot of anxiety, that's something to keep an eye out for. And then also, if you notice that you have you feel out of control when you're eating things. And so if you feel like, obviously, like, there are diagnostic criteria for binge eating disorder, but if you just find that, you have a food like granola, and you buy it a couple times a year or a few times a year, and then every time you feel like you can't eat to the point of comfort, then that could be a sign that maybe you have some strict rules around food. So if you feel like there are good foods and bad foods, foods that are just like not allowed to be in your diet at all, outside of like ethical or religious reasons.
Sure. Yeah.
Those are some other signals too. So usually when we feel like we need to have like a lot of control and rigidity around our body and our food, those are signs that we might not be in the most balanced relationship that we could have.
Awesome. Well, these are obviously very complex topics that's impossible to cover in 20 or even in 2 hours. It's be tough to cover. So I know you have a lot of resources for this. So where can people find more of your stuff?
Yeah, absolutely. So if they're interested in learning more about sort of the history of dieting and diet culture and even calorie counting, I've got some articles looking back at that at btgcomprehensivecoaching.com. Shannon Beer and I are also putting on a couple of webinars starting this Thursday, actually. You can also buy tickets for the webinars there. So those are the Bridging the Gap with Comprehensive Coaching webinars. Shannon also has some awesome body image webinars. And I also have a website, Vitamin PhD Nutrition. So if folks are interested in working together to find that place of balance with their food and their body, then please feel free to reach out and follow me on Instagram at Vitamin PhD.
Awesome. Dr. Fundaro, always a great time talking to you. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
All right, everybody. So today we have future doc, Elizabeth Rohde. How we doing?
Hi. Future doc, really hyping me up.
Yep.
So I will say this podcast is representative of only my opinion and not of my school, which we have to say that now in today's day and age. But hey, at least we can make it funny.
Yeah. So I've been on your podcast, which we can also have a link for below. You've got your own Instagram page. You do coach a lot of female clients. Do you coach any male clients?
I do. Yeah.
Okay. So both, but I know, we talked about kind of coaching people. I've referred to you and vice versa and whatnot. So how long have you been in the coaching game? We're obviously going to delve here into, body image issues and eating disorders and stuff. But the main reason that I kind of got this together was, and as I've said probably other times in this podcast, that as I've gotten more female clients, I've seen, and I mean, this is something I've known for a long time, that you see a lot of body image issues and eating disorders in women. And having the different guests on this podcast, we're kind of tackling it from different views, different viewpoints. And so obviously I wanted to bring you on knowing that you have some experience, and it's somewhere that like we have some of the same connections in this industry as well. So I thought I'd get your input there. So how did you get into, I guess, fitness? And then also how did you get into starting to coach a lot of other women?
Right. So I got into fitness maybe 10 or more years ago. I was always like heavy overweight growing up, and obesity and addiction and all that jazz runs in my family. So I saw what it was doing to family members like daily. And I was like, okay, this can't be me. Like, this cannot be me. This is where it stops. So I lost a lot of weight going into my like junior year of high school. I was on the track team. I was throwing. So that was fun. And then like I primarily started like lifting, Olympic weightlifting for track. And then I kind of stopped after I did track for a year in college, and I stopped for like, 6 months. And then I started doing like a bodybuilding style split, like a bro split. And then recently my diet, I really started getting, hammering down on the diet with macros and tracking calories and all that jazz. Because at first, like I was just eating healthy. I was just eating based on guidelines. And then I wanted to start getting into like, I want to look good, like good. So that's what I ended up doing. And then as that transformation started taking place, I was getting stronger. I was getting more muscular. A lot of my friends were like, hey, do you coach? Do you write programs? And I like refused to take clients until I tested for my personal trainer cert. So that was like probably a little over 2 years ago. So I tested for it, started taking clients. Then I got into the vertical diet, won their challenge, and then I got vertical diet coaching certified. So okay. Yeah.
Nice. Yeah. I actually didn't know you got certified with vertical diet, but I knew you won that competition. And I think that's actually a lot of how some of us get into coaching. It's like we get into just doing it ourselves, and then people start to ask our advice. And then after a while, and then of course, just like having a name out there, like as much as I've been coaching people for years now, obviously, once I started the podcast and the Instagram page and everything like that, I mean, the inquiries have, quadrupled at least. Right. Which I think we should also point out, though, that just because somebody has a name on social media does not mean they're a good coach. And just because somebody doesn't have a presence, obviously doesn't mean that they're a bad coach. I mean, it's when you actually see sometimes some of the like inquiries people get, or how much attention somebody gets just because, I mean, just, I don't even say the name, but my sister got a program from somebody and she's like, oh, this person. I was like, who wrote this for you though? And she's like, oh, she's this person, looks like this, and it's amazing. And not surprisingly, she kept up with it for like 2 weeks. It was just like, she doesn't have any background in this stuff at all. So she was doing like 6 days a week, 2-hour sessions. And obviously like within 2 weeks, she was like, I hate this. And she just like burned out. And that's unfortunately, this person's got like hundreds of thousands of followers and, you know, this reputation and looks amazing. Right. And, you know, not to get too much into a rant, but that is, I think one of the things fueling these issues we see is that people, they don't get into it appropriately. I think it's probably always going to be the case that people associate this person looks good with this person knows what they're doing. And then that just leads to more and more issues that we see in the industry.
Right. Well, and the thing with social media is it's all curated, and, you know, the people who look like they do, they didn't just start there. They didn't magically just start working out 6 days a week, 2 hours a day, you know, like they had to work up from somewhere. They had to have good habits. They had to enjoy it. And then they had to do that for like years. They couldn't just magically become like a bikini competitor overnight. Like when I started competing, like I literally was lifting for like 10 years. Like I wasn't just like, oh yeah, I think I'll compete now, you know, like, so
now you competed in powerlifting, bikini, and was there something else?
I did figure, and then I did powerlifting.
Okay. Gotcha.
Yeah.
And then you were talking about potentially doing like, there's a new division now, wellness, right?
Right. So then we were talking about that new division that they came out. It's like 2 years old, maybe 1 year old. So that's interesting because that's kind of like morphing the way that, I don't know, I guess competitors are viewed, because it's bringing in like extra body types kind of. Yeah. It's like bikini versus wellness versus figure versus physique, you know.
And part of me is like, you know, is that all that necessary? Because honestly, like I feel like, and somebody else said this, they were like, you know, you could take the winner from one category and in a lot of like competitions, they would win like 3 of the other categories, you know, because they're just not that different. I guess with
it's
wellness,
all about posing. It's all about
it seems like a lot of posing. Some different body types. So like obviously from like bikini to bodybuilding or to wellness, even like some of the pictures you were showing me of like the wellness competitors was vastly different than what you'd see in like a typical bikini one. I mean, I know girls who compete in bikini who have been lifting for like a year, you know, and that's typically not going to be, but they'll do okay, you know. But
it's, well, with bikini, it's all about presentation and leanness, and you know, like if you look pretty and bouncy on stage and you're very lean, you're fine for bikini most of the time. So
do you think that there is, and I mean, from like a competitor's standpoint, you know, I would say, and again, I'm not looking at like local shows, I'm just seeing what people post on like national levels and stuff, but probably the majority of women have breast implants. There are, you know, obviously like tons of like makeup and everything. I mean, to some degree, it's more of like a pageant, it seems like, then, and I don't know if like the bodybuilding section is like that, but certainly like bikini and stuff. Do you think that that just fuels? Because I think from like a men's side, we talk about how this fuels this need to be lean year round and all these problems. From like the women's side, I just feel like there's this, it fuels the I don't know, the need, or like in their mind, the need to have this ideal body type and now even get plastic surgery for it.
Right. Well, and I will say the majority of competitors that go far do have breast implants. Now, I've worked in plastic surgery at the Cleveland Clinic. I've seen breast implants. It's a decently lucrative surgery to get. It, you know, it's up to you. It's your body image. It's how you feel good, right? But most of the people in competitions, you know, if you get that lean, like I'm going to tell you right now that you don't have fat tissue, and breasts are mostly fat tissue. So most of the people who want to be judged as feminine or look feminine on stage, have a certain shape, will get the breast implants for judging purposes. And because, you know, like a lot of people don't feel feminine unless they have breast tissue. And if you're super lean, you just don't have that. So, you know, how else are you going to get that? Probably doing plastic surgery. And I will say I do follow a lot of figure competitors who have great pecs, great, you know, chest split or whatever. And they end up getting breast implants a couple of years into competing. Or they end up like DLB, Dana Lynn Bailey, when she won her physique contest. You know, she was told in figure, because she tried to do figure, that she looked too manly. She looked like a guy. So when she started doing figure, they were looking for femininity.
Yeah.
So
can you give a little bit more of your background? I know we said, you know, you're a future doctor, but as far as like your background, you said you worked with some plastic surgery at Cleveland Clinic. Just go into that a little bit.
Well, so and this also ties into coaching too, because, you know, like I am in medical school and I am in science, and a lot of women just aren't. So it's kind of like a mentorship role almost as a coach at this point.
Mm-hmm.
And it's actually really gratifying and really great to teach women like what science is, instead of being like, oh, hey, you know, I'm just some, you know, smiling coach face, you know.
Yeah.
But so as far as plastic surgery, I was interested in plastic surgery, being a plastic surgeon for forever, like probably since high school. So I came out here and I did my master's in bioethics, and I was shadowing in an ER at Cleveland Clinic. And I happened to meet a plastic surgery resident while I was down in there. And there was a code being run, and I was like telling him about the Lucas CPR device, and it was like this whole thing. And he was like, hey, why don't you come work in our lab? So I got a first author paper out of Dr. Basiri's lab in metabolomics of limb perfusion, which is basically like if you get in a car accident and your limb gets chopped off, we can keep it alive until we can reattach it, is basically what it is. And then we ran a lot of metabolomic studies on it. And so most of the funding was from like DOD, Department of Defense, for military work. And then that's ultimately the journal that I ended up getting published in, was a military journal. So it was some pretty heavy duty, like very high scientific stuff. And then via that, I met Dr. Brunegraber from Case Western, which he's done a lot of work with like the keto diet and ketones and all that fun stuff. So his name has been used in a bunch of different keto podcasts across, like I think Paul Saladino or something like that. He was in one of them. But yeah, so there's this weird intersection between science and
interesting
and muscle research and plastic surgery, and somehow I ended up in the middle of all of it.
Yeah, that's awesome. So do you find, I mean, as far as the women who have had to get like plastic surgery, I mean, we're mainly referring to like the breast implants here, but I know certainly, I mean, this doesn't just apply to women. I mean, people will get liposuction, I've seen ab implants, you know.
They'll get injections and, you know, lip fillers and face surgery and Botox and all that fun stuff too. Like it's not.
Yeah. Do you find that people who get these surgeries, I mean, because you can see both ways, right? Like I'm not somebody who's against plastic surgery. I think that there are people who either in their head or really like a real, I don't want to say like a real problem, because it's subjective, but something that legitimately bothers them. And I don't think it's my place or anybody's place to say like, oh, like you're wrong for having an issue with that. You know, if you are an A cup and that just really bothers you, or there's a pretty well-known plastic surgeon out in I think it's San Francisco, and he was saying, you know, like he gets a lot of women who are Middle Eastern, and you know, they have like these beautiful features, and they have a big problem with like their nose, and then it's a huge transformation. Whatever it is, I think that's totally fine. I think the problem comes from if it's like, hey, I'm going to, I don't know, love myself more, or like this is going to fix my issue. And rather than it's like, I'm doing this for, you know, my own self improvement and something that I like. And that's a really fine line, right? How do you determine like, this is just a personal issue versus like, this is a psychological issue? I mean, I don't think it's so clear cut. And that's obviously it's, go ahead.
That's kind of how the field of ethics kind of comes into play, right?
Yeah.
I mean, these are elective surgeries, but you know, are we doing a psych consult for every single surgery that we do? Absolutely not.
Right.
Are the surgeons sitting and talking and consulting with their patient, getting full consent, and they're paying out of pocket because insurance is not covering it?
Right.
Yes. So at that point, it's like, you know, they're not being coerced. They came in and they came to seek it out themselves. So
yeah. I mean, it's funny actually. Earlier with Gabrielle, she was talking about like in reference to me saying like, you know, if somebody comes and they want filler, but it's like there's a certain point where it's like I'm not going to give you any more, right? Or there's other things.
Well, and then there's like, you know, medical contraindications. You cannot give a certain amount of filler, right?
Sure.
You can put filler in the wrong spot, and somebody could lose their sight. And they, you know, like there's different medical contraindications, and the patient needs to be informed about all of it.
Yeah.
So,
but
I don't think people like are educated about that though. You know,
well,
like
and that's kind of like tying back into like from the competition standpoint, like how many people, because I mean, I don't know if a lot of people realize this, but a lot of plastic surgery is not done by board certified plastic surgeons.
Right.
Yeah. And then obviously it's going to depend on the procedure, right? I mean, something like for breast implants, probably I think the statistic is like 80% of them are done by board certified plastic surgeons, which is what you would want for a procedure like that's so invasive.
Right.
Then there's
But
other
some
things that
aren't.
are not. What's that?
But some
I know,
aren't.
which is kind of crazy.
Yeah.
I think of something like that serious. Liposuction is another one that is done very frequently by like med spas and things like that. People who they can just, buy like a, what is that? Like cool sculpting machine or something like that and do it. You can get some of these like, really irreversible scars. So, and I don't want to get down that whole rabbit hole, but just to say that I do think that when you get into like the world of bodybuilding and serious competitors, it's like this escalation ladder to like kind of like crazier and crazier things. And that could apply to drug use, that you just start with a little, the thyroid medication, and then it's like add some clen, and then all of a sudden you're taking more and more. It can go for plastic surgeries. Hey, well, I'm just gonna, do this one thing. And then, and again, I'm not necessarily completely against anything, but
well, everybody's an adult. They can choose what they want to do, right? But if you think changing your body is going to fix your self-worth issues, it's probably not the case. It's probably not.
Yeah.
Because it's like how I feel like you and I specifically eat a certain way because we want to be healthy at the end of the day. And I feel like that's a little bit different than some of the people in the fitness industry who, especially competitors, who end up being like, well, I have to fit in this little box of what a bigger judge is going to judge for.
Right.
And I will do whatever it takes to get X trophy.
So do you think those people who have self-worth issues, and I mean, I do have an opinion on this, and obviously I want to hear yours, that the people who have these self-worth issues, do you think that the competition and like the surgeries and the things that go with it just fuel it? Like they might be thinking this is going to better me, and in reality, like it just exacerbates these problems that already exist.
It could exacerbate it. It really could. A lot of people, especially, if you get really obsessed with something, it's kind of lonely. Yeah. Like you end up isolating yourself and getting really into whatever it is, which is not bad necessarily, but when you're at the top of your game, it's isolating. So to each their own. If that makes you happy, fine.
Have you seen people who, after going down the rabbit hole of competitions and like, body manipulation, things like that, have tried to like almost like reverse everything, either surgically or otherwise, that they end up in a worse situation than they were to begin with?
I wouldn't say worse. I've seen people get like fillers reversed with like hyaluronidase if they get the hyaluronic acid fillers and stuff like that. Like sometimes they just go in and it's a little bit too jarring and there was just too much put in, stuff like that. But I don't know, like there's people who get tattoos and get tattoo removal. So it's just like, it's all depending on your state of mind during it, why you're getting it, for what reason, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah. Oh, I think your perspective is interesting because like you are doing a lot, right? I mean, you're like, obviously you're in med school. You also coach. You also have your podcast going on. And then to do all these like competitions, I think you're probably a good model for somebody who wants to be achieving a lot. But it doesn't, at least from my conversations with you, it doesn't seem like you have like any like psychological issues in the sense that I noticed that like you like hate your body or things like that. Like, of course you, and like, it's interesting because you so want to improve it, right? Like a lot of us do. But I don't know if that's an inherent quality to you or if you would have advice for women to, because most people, it's like, I don't know, again, correlation or causation, most people who strive as much as you do for the improvements end up having some unhealthy psychology behind it. Whether that's what drives them to do it, which is a lot of people, or in becoming so obsessive with the improvements, they end up having that kind of like negative, feedback there. So I don't know if that's something that you can speak of, or if it's just something that you just naturally noticed in yourself.
So this is going to be pretty interesting. There's a couple different routes that I could take with this answer. So one, I've seen the extremes on the other end with obesity and addiction. So I'm just, going as far away as humanly possible that I can from that is my MO. Two, I'm pretty masochistic in the gym. I enjoy really, being in pain, doing as many sets as, like it's bad. So now like I've had to, get a coach to program me so that I don't go overtrain at like usual.
Yeah.
So there's that. And that I think is like my outlet most of the time. I use training as an outlet rather than a progress type of deal. Now, obviously, like if I follow a correct program, I will make progress because I will go in anyways, because it's my outlet. And I feel like it's usually the other way around in people with body image issues. I'm going to the gym because I hate myself, because I have to, because I'm burning calories. And that's just like the wrong mindset, I think, to have. I think you should go to feel good because you enjoy it, because it's an outlet, because it's a stress release. Any of the above is pretty much a better mindset than I hate myself, so I'm forcing myself to go through this punishment.
Right.
Because that's just not sustainable and that's not going to work out. And also, exercise in itself is like the healthiest thing you could possibly do for your body. For your mood boosting, it increases BDNF, it increases memory consolidation, increases neuroplasticity, it keeps your brain alive, it literally like reduces the risk of Alzheimer's, like all of these things. For you to go in and hate it, like it doesn't make sense. So there's that. And then there's also like, I was a fat kid growing up. I'm not going to lie, like I did not like myself for a long time. And my main attribute was probably like me being smart and sitting in my room reading all the time. So, you know what I mean? Like I have different facets of being rather than just how I look. And I will be like, disclaimer, like I've never gotten plastic surgery. I just worked, in a plastic surgeon office. You know what I mean? Like, so it's just like, there's different facets of being rather than just how you look. And I think that's what people are missing, because you can improve in multiple areas of your life. You do not need to be a supermodel. You can model, like I made great money modeling, but like you don't have to.
Yeah.
You can be
well,
smart.
I think having those other things, and that's probably, and it may be like a good point to wrap up on too, is that's something you do see a lot in this space, is that's somebody's like whole identity. And when I see that, like I get almost sad for the person, because it's like, it's not that I have a problem with somebody like, having certain poses on Instagram or whatever, like I don't care, but it's more like, man, like that's clearly all that you have going for you, / that's your identity completely.
Right. And I hate making it negative like that. You know what I mean? Because like, what if that person's actually really proud of themselves, or maybe they came so far from some other thing. But I feel like the gym is my way of controlling the rest of everything around me. I treat my school kind of like training. I do some every day. I train some every day. I eat healthy every day. It's not some random accomplishment. I'm at the right place at the right time and I'm prepared, Yeah. And
you also
that's how
don't
body
have,
image is.
Like, as much like I agree with you in the sense that like, no, it's fine. Like if modeling is your thing, that's fine. I just, from what I've seen, a lot of times when that's completely your identity and you tie your self-worth to that, it's like you literally cannot keep that up. It's impossible, like long term.
Well, and then what sucks is like, what happens if it, like everybody has a fat day or whatever, or everybody has a bad hair day. It's like, is that going to literally tear your entire world apart? Like you need to be a little bit stronger than that. You know what I'm saying? So I don't know.
Yeah. And not to say like, I mean, don't get me wrong. Somebody might hear that and say, well, what do you mean? Like, I know people who are 50 and they still look amazing. And like, I'm not saying that's not true, but it's very rare that like, if you have objective beauty standards, which is pretty much impossible, but I'm just saying like, it's very rare that you're going to say, okay, at 60, I'm like looking like I did at like 25, and you shouldn't be expected to, like, you shouldn't, I don't think that would be reasonable. I think you should focus on health first, right? What else are you offering to the world? What are you as far as like providing value and things like that? And if you look awesome while you do it, that's fantastic. And it's not for me to say what your goals should be. I just think on average, most people who completely tie their self-worth to how they look, that's a losing battle,
Well, yeah. And it speaks a lot to mental health stuff too, because like I've started coaching plenty of clients that started out with anxiety, depression, obesity, blah, 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 blah. And then I coach them for like a year and they start getting off their meds and they start sleeping better and they start, you know, really liking their job much more than they did before. And it's not just, oh, wow, I hate myself and I hate how I look. It's, you know, I'm not performing for me. I'm not passionate about something outside of myself. Like you can't be in your head all day and be happy. Like that's just not, you have to be somewhat in a flow state outside of that somewhere. Totally. Right?
All right, Elizabeth. Well, thank you for taking the time. We will obviously have links to Instagram and anywhere else we can find you. Are there other places besides Instagram people can find you?
I do have a YouTube channel for the podcast that I run. So that's it's just my name, Elizabeth Rohde on YouTube. And the podcast is the Ethical Epidemic, if I could talk.
There's some awesome podcast guests I'm aware of.
Yeah, one of them's Dave. But yeah, that's pretty much it right now for online presence. Yeah.
Cool. Thanks again.
Thanks.
All right. So today we have on the podcast Jessica Terrier. How you doing, Jess?
Good. How are you?
Good. So we've chatted for a while. You are one of the esteemed members of the Revive Stronger team. And as we were discussing, I'm kind of doing this roundtable here where we're going to delve into body dysmorphia and eating disorders and things in that regard. For women who are getting into the lifting space, everybody's kind of got a little bit of a different niche in the industry. And one of the things that you and I were going to talk about, because it's something that you have good experience with, is purposefully gaining weight and bulking up as a woman. You know, I think for guys, it's almost seen as, I mean, I've said before, I get more compliments almost the fatter I get, because most of the time my clothes are on, and with my clothes on, I just look bigger, right? And so, I mean, literally, like when I bulked up to my fattest, I was still getting compliments on how big I was looking, right? And for women, that's usually not the case. And usually they feel like they just want to be leaner and leaner. So before we delve into that, can you just give a little bit of your background? How did you get involved with Revive Stronger? And what is your lifting background?
Sure. So I started lifting 4 or 5 years ago with my ex. It wasn't really proper lifting. It wasn't structured. It was like bro kind of thing. And then I broke up with him and I asked Steve, who was my coach at the time. So Steve is the founder of Revive Stronger. I asked him where I could actually get some legit medication within the industry. And he sent me to JPS in Australia. So I went to JPS, got my certification. I did an in-person mentorship there. And then Steve offered me with Pascal the job of intern at Revive Stronger. And I turned full-time coach last August. So not even a year ago. Oh, wow. So I've been coaching for them for a year and a half now. It's been great. And I've done my first prep as a bikini competitor in 2019 in Australia in the IFBB, and I'm currently prepping to step on the stage at the end of this year. So I also have that as an experience to know like when to gain. Maybe that gives a little bit more context as to like the importance of actually massing and then cutting to look like you lift on stage.
Yeah, awesome. I didn't realize that you had actually worked with Steve that long ago. So it was like close to 5 years ago.
No, 3. I hired Steve in 2018. And before that, I was lifting for about a couple of years by myself.
Okay. Gotcha. Cool. So on that topic of, when you dieted down and wanted to bulk back up, did you personally find that was hard for you? I mean, obviously there's going to be some subset of the population of women who are totally fine with it, that they just fully embrace it. And that's one of the reasons I think it's positive for a lot of people, including women, to maybe get into powerlifting where or like just that general idea of, okay, gaining strength is cool, gaining weight can be cool. And that community is usually very supportive of that. And that's, I think, a benefit to a lot of people. But did you find that you were somebody who just naturally went into it, or did it take a long time mentally to adjust?
I think at the very first beginning, when I started with Steve, it was easy because I had no clue. I wasn't really involved in social media. I wasn't really following any like fit pros or anyone that was really lean year round. So I didn't have that kind of social media pressure to stay lean or remain lean all the time. So the first massing phase was actually pretty easy. I gained something like 10 kilos in a year, which is like enormous. And when I arrived in Australia to start my prep, I was fairly chubby, but I was really confident. I was really feeling good in my own skin because I had packed on a lot of muscle mass as well. Which is one thing we need to mention as well, is that if you want to actually be gaining muscle, you're going to have to be gaining a little bit of fat and body weight in general. But yeah, the first time was actually pretty easy because I had no expectations. I had no pressure from social media or anything else. And then I stepped on stage and the cycle started with like, okay, I have some body image issues. I'm stage lean. I don't want to get over fat. So now I have to restrict myself even when I'm massing because I don't want to get I don't want to gain too much body fat. And yeah, so I had both sides of the coin where I had a really easy way gaining the first time. And now it's a little bit harder just because I know what it is to be lean. I know what it looks like for me to actually be stage lean and really lean. So it gets complicated, but I think it's still important whenever you're feeling like you have some body image issues to actually keep pushing and try to just be okay with the fact that you're gaining weight, if that makes sense.
Yeah. When you went into it, did you know you were going to compete when you were gaining that 10 kilos?
No, I had no clue I wanted to compete. I knew I wanted to compete, but I didn't have a set date on it. So I had no clue that was going to be that close. But then I got the opportunity to compete in Australia and to do my prep at JPS. So I was like, okay, I'm just going to jump on that. But no, I didn't know I was going to compete right after the first gaining phase. So yeah, the first gaining phase I think was also easy because I was really excited to actually put on muscle. And I think that's something we don't talk about enough because most people are actually very excited to get lean, to cut, especially for females. But we never talk about like, hey, like massing is exciting. Massing is fun. Like whatever you want to call it. It's like, that's why I tell my clients, it's where the party's at. Like your energy level, your energy availability, your training is amazing. You're not overly food focused. You can enjoy the foods that you like. Your sex drive is high. Like everything is just working great at that point. So I think there's some things to mention about gaining, that it's really fun. Cutting is easy. Putting on muscle is like fairly hard, and you need to dedicate some actual time towards it. So I think we need to maybe talk a little bit more about the benefits of massing. And yeah, it's just a fun time. You get to eat the food, you get to have social time. It's a lot more pros than cons, in my opinion.
Yeah, it's funny because, I mean, first of all, I didn't realize that your first bulk up was that much. I mean, definitely for someone your size, that's pretty significant. You know, you're talking like 22 pounds. And then on top of that, when you say, well, cutting's easy and bulking up or gaining muscle is hard. And I remember like, I don't know, 15 years ago now, having like an argument on a forum about that because there was a big bodybuilder guy saying basically that. And I said, well, it depends on, I guess, what you mean by easy or simple. So I think dieting is simple and it can be done fast, right? But most people find it a more difficult process. You know, you suffer more, you know, the sleep can get affected. There's a lot of hunger. Bulking definitely takes more time to gain a substantial amount of muscle. Not to mention that I think while, you know, genetics are going to influence one's ability to lose fat, anybody can lose fat, right? Like it's almost everybody can. But there's a point where you just can't keep gaining muscle, right? And you're just not going to be able to do it at a certain point. But as you said, the process of gaining muscle tends to be a lot more fun and a lot more enjoyable, you know, and you're not, like you said, focused on food all the time. You're usually sleeping better. You're actually hitting PRs in the gym. So that process is a lot more fun.
I think not only it's fun, but it's pretty straightforward. Like you have a goal and you just have to follow the simple rules of like, okay, I need to get stronger in the gym. I just need to do a little bit better and a little bit more than previously. I just need to be gaining weight over time and making sure that I manage the rate of gain. That's it. That's everything you have to do to be massing. It's pretty straightforward. It's pretty simple. And I'm not saying that dieting is fairly easy. It's a whole process, and it's not fun, and it's hard. But yeah, as you said, I think everybody has the ability to lose fat pretty easily, and you don't have to be overly focused on it. So yeah, I think there's just a lot of misconceptions about gaining weight for females. Maybe there's a negative connotation to the way we call it, because it's always like massing, bulking, gaining. It's always like all those negative connotations, like, oh, it means I'm going to gain fat. But you're not just going to gain fat. You're also going to gain a lot of muscle in the process. And that's what we're after. And you can always minimize the amount of muscle, the amount of fat that you're gaining compared to the amount of muscle. And that's something you can regulate with having some rate of gains, with trying to maybe adjust your calories weekly if something is going a little bit too fast for your liking. But there's always something we can do. So yeah, I think it's just a misconception about gaining for females. Like, it's really fun, it's pretty easy, and you're not gonna look like you're fat. On the opposite, like, that's when you have the more like curvy kind of look that is really pleasable, like to like everybody's eyes, really. So you don't have to stay lean to look good. And that's really something I talk about on social media a lot. You don't have to be lean to be relevant. It doesn't mean that, like, because a lot of people, like a lot of Instagram models and fitness professionals, like they get paid, they can actually monetize their body image. Not everybody's going to be able to do that. And you don't have to stay lean to actually be relevant, first. And second, people don't understand that those people maybe are like the 1% at the top who don't have a hard time just staying lean year round. Or maybe they just don't talk about how hard it is for them to stay lean because they think they have to stay lean to be relevant. Does that make any sense?
Yeah, I mean, and also like you said, there has been, at least as far as like kind of like our industry and the people we talk with, there's been a shift, I think, in recent years to less of just being skinny and more, like you said, having curves and things like that. And that's, you know, hugely individual. I don't think you should try to chase what is like the current start, like the ideal look currently, right? Because that's going to change and you should do it for you. But I do see a trend that people do prefer like more muscle now, and like you said, some curves rather than just being very skinny. And secondly, I think to your point earlier about bulking up, most people, especially if you've done a significant bulk, find that that makes the diet later, when you do eventually want to diet down, easier, not just because you've increased your metabolism, increased the amount of muscle mass, but your appetite is significantly less and you get used to the point. I mean, most women who are chronically dieting have no idea what it's like to even be full for days on end, right? I mean, I can tell you as a guy who's bulked up many times, you do, even with a big appetite, you get to a point where like, you know what, I'm ready to not keep shoving food down my face, right? And so that kind of gets you into the idea of, okay, now I can start bringing food down. And I just think it makes the process a little easier. And again, that's even just psychologically, it makes it easier. So when you have somebody, let's say I'm obviously you have plenty of female clients, do you find that you kind of put the training first in the nutrition in terms of saying, well, if we get you bulking up first, or should we get you stronger first? Are there things that you focus on even in your wording to it, depending on their background?
Yeah, first I just want to piggyback on what you just said about whatever you were just saying, like the whole idea. It's, if you want to be lean and look like you actually lift weight, you need to have muscle mass on, meaning that you need to be gaining first. Because if you just like if you just intend to be shredded and you don't have any muscle mass, you're just going to look skinny, like model, like 2000 model skinny, like really like this old school, like really thin look. And it's usually what not people are after. Like they want to look like they actually lift, and you need to be putting on muscle first. So yeah, when I have female clients and we're massing, or the goal is massing, I usually try to put performance first, and I actually really put an emphasis on training and making sure that we're not overly focused on the scale weight or anything like that. I just take the data as it is, data. I take measurements every like 6 weeks maybe, but it's usually a big emphasis on how stronger they're getting in the gym, how enjoyable is the training program, so they can actually thrive on the program and they're not taking too much time thinking or overthinking about gaining weight or how they look. But the more I do it, the more I realize that they're actually there's this big shift in the industry where females are actually more comfortable gaining weight and being in like massing phases. And yeah, I have female clients that are actually like, yeah, like I love being thicker. It's actually really enjoyable for me. And because they can feel the side effects of being stronger in the gym and everything else that comes with it, they're actually feeling so much better. So yeah, I really put an emphasis on training rather than nutrition when they're massing. And yeah, I just as a coach, I take a look sometimes at how they look and I ask them the questions like, hey, how are you feeling mentally about your body? I try to ask the question like every month just to make sure that we're on track with everything and that their mental health is still pretty good. And I honestly haven't had like a negative feedback yet. Like they're okay massing, they're okay with focusing on training. Yeah, I think putting an emphasis on training and maybe having a more performance goal is easier for them in the off season, so they can actually chase numbers in the gym rather than just looking at numbers on the scale.
So I guess as a final question here, let's say, because obviously there's going to be people who come here and there are a lot of what we're talking about where they're already skinny, chronically dieting, and they're having a hard time gaining the weight. What do you do if you have a female client who's come to you and they've been in this kind of yo-yo cycle, chronically dieting still for a year or whatever extended period of time, but they are admittedly still what people would call overweight? Their body fat is still relatively high. Do you take that person and try to, even like the other clients, still try to say, hey, let's focus on training goals? Do you acknowledge that, hey, you are probably still pretty high in body fat, let's work on bringing that down? How would you approach that for somebody who's already kind of in that cycle?
I would first ask them what they want to do, what they want to be doing, and then I will give them my opinion on if what they want to be doing is a good idea. I think there's nothing wrong with chasing cutting phases or chasing being leaner if that's going to make your mental health better and if that's going to make you more comfortable in your skin and more able to actually do things in the gym that's going to be productive in the long term. So I would ask them first, what do you want to be doing? What are your goals? And then we can break those goals down into maybe mini goals along the way. But I would always ask them first what they feel comfortable doing and go with that first if I can, because their motivation is going to be higher and their adherence is going to be higher. So if they need to body recomp, I will maybe explain to them how education is going to be important, how tracking food maybe is going to be important and valuable for us to do. But yeah, I usually choose the option that they want to follow, and I try to work around maybe some terms that are not fixed from the get-go, so we can actually work together in combination and it's not detrimental to their mental health, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
No, I mean, I think it's good. People might have an idea of like, well, you have to do one thing or another, but at the end of the day, if a client is not on board with what you're advising, even if it's the right decision, they're not going to follow it, and so then you're going to end up not helping them along the way. So I think there's a point where you're going to say, hey, I don't think it's healthy to do XYZ thing, but for the most part, obviously, I still think you should be taking into consideration what their current goals are.
Yeah, it's only the limitation of health, obviously. Like if someone is like with a high body fat percentage, I'm not going to tell them to keep bulking. I'm probably going to say, hey, there might be another solution. We can body recomp. We don't have to drop your calories too low, but we can definitely do something productive. And it's always putting their demands first and maybe just letting them know what are the options if what they want to be chasing seems unrealistic, or like actually letting them know like, hey, maybe this isn't realistic for now in this time frame, so we need to reframe how we're going to do things. But yeah, always taking into consideration their want first, so it's easy for them to adhere and have someone guide the ship maybe.
Awesome. Well, Jess, thank you for taking the time. I think a lot of people watching already follow you, but where can people find more of your stuff?
Jess Dalglish on Instagram, and that's pretty much it. We have a member site with Revive Stronger where we put out a lot of content. We have the Revive Stronger podcast, obviously. But yeah, Jess Dalglish on Instagram, the easiest way to find me.
Awesome. I will have links to that down below. Thanks again.
Thank you for having me on.